February 1969. Central Highlands of Vietnam. The jungle pulsed with gunfire and fear. Tracer rounds carved green fire through the night, while mortars thudded in the distance. The ground shook, leaves fell like rain, and the air smelled of gunpowder and blood. Medics crawled through the dirt, dragging the wounded toward the tree line. Among them was a man who carried no weapon. His name was Thomas Bennett, and he was about to prove that courage had nothing to do with killing. The Vietnam War had become a grinder of flesh and willpower. Battles weren't fought in open fields, but in the wet suffocation of jungle canopies, where every tree could hide a sniper and every step could trigger a mine. Helicopters came and went like angry hornets, their blades scattering mud over men who hadn't slept in days. For medics, it was hell multiplied. They ran towards screams, not away from them. They learned to tune out fear, to crawl through fields of shrapnel just to stop one more artery from bleeding out. Every mission tested the limits of sanity. Every day began with the same thought: maybe this is the one I don't come back from. By the time Bennett arrived, the war had already swallowed thousands. Soldiers learned to carry death in their pockets like loose change. Faith cracked under the weight of it. Men prayed less and drank more. Each morning began with a roll call and ended with silence for the ones who wouldn't answer tomorrow. Bennett's unit, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, operated near Pleiku, deep in the highlands. It was enemy territory, a place where the jungle itself seemed alive, whispering, watching, waiting. Patrols vanished into its green maze and never returned. Yet orders kept coming. Another sweep, another ambush, another day where medics would fight to keep hearts beating in the dirt. The Americans fought for hills, ridges and numbers on a map. The Viet Cong fought for time. Every victory cost too much. Every hill was taken twice. Soldiers learned to measure success not in territory, but in survival. In this world, the idea of an unarmed man running into battle seemed impossible. Yet Bennett's courage would soon eclipse every weapon around him. He had come not to destroy but to heal, a contradiction wrapped in olive drab. His rifle sling carried only bandages. His holster held morphine, not bullets. As the firefights intensified, his presence became a quiet constant, a calm voice under chaos. He didn't shout, didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. When mortars landed, he was already moving. When others hit the ground, he ran forward. That was the reality of Vietnam in 1969. A war of fire and mud, of bravery measured not by the number of enemies killed, but by the lives pulled back from the edge. And somewhere in that inferno, Thomas Bennett, the man without a weapon, was about to carve his name into history. He didn't want glory, he didn't seek death. But fate doesn't ask for permission, and in a war that devoured heroes, it was mercy, not violence, that would make him immortal. April 1947, Morgantown, West Virginia. Morning fog rolled off the Monongahela River and over the small town still half asleep. A church bell rang in the distance. Inside a modest wooden house, a young boy sat by the window, sketching airplanes on notebook paper. His name was Thomas Bennett. The world outside was simple, quiet, and far removed from the chaos that would one day claim him. He was the middle child of a working-class family, raised in a place where everyone knew each other's names. His father worked long hours at a construction site. His mother kept the home warm and orderly. Sundays were for church, suppers, and hymns that echoed through the valley. Life was humble, but it had rhythm, the kind of rhythm that builds discipline in small, invisible ways. Thomas wasn't loud or restless like other boys. He was thoughtful, curious, drawn to helping rather than competing. When others fought over toys, he settled disputes. When a neighbour's barn caught fire, he was there with a bucket before anyone asked. Compassion came naturally to him, as if it were stitched into his blood. At school, teachers noticed something quiet but firm behind his blue eyes: conviction. He wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest athlete, but when something was wrong, he spoke up. Fairness mattered to him more than winning. That sense of justice deepened as he grew older, shaped by his faith and by the stories of war still fresh in America's memory. World War II had ended only a few years before his birth, but its echoes lingered in every household. Fathers and brothers returned changed, some missing limbs, others missing light in their eyes. Young Thomas listened to their stories with equal parts awe and discomfort. He respected their sacrifice but wondered why humans needed to destroy each other to prove courage. By the time he reached college, those questions had sharpened into beliefs. He studied at West Virginia University, majoring in biology. He was the kind of student who spent more time in volunteer programs than in dorm parties. He tutored kids, donated blood, and helped the elderly. His friends joked that he had an old soul, too kind, too earnest, too pure for politics or war. Then came the draft. The Vietnam War was escalating, pulling young men from classrooms into jungles half a world away. Names were being drawn in lotteries. Thomas Bennett's was one of them. He read the letter slowly, as if its words might change if he looked hard enough. It was the kind of moment that divides a life into before and after. He wasn't afraid of serving. He was afraid of betraying what he believed. To him, violence wasn't bravery. It was failure. Taking a life was something sacred, something no human had the right to do. But he also believed in responsibility, in showing up when the world needed help. So he made a choice that few understood. He declared himself a conscientious objector, someone who would serve his country but never carry a weapon. Friends warned him it would bring ridicule. Family feared for his safety, but his voice never wavered. If men were going to die, he wanted to be there, not to fight, but to save. In a nation divided by war, Thomas Bennett's decision made him an outsider. Yet, deep down, he knew it was the only path that matched his conscience. And somewhere beyond those quiet hills, fate was waiting. A place where ideals would collide with bullets, and where one man's faith in humanity would be tested in the most merciless way imaginable. July 1968, Charleston, West Virginia. The courthouse clock struck noon as Thomas Bennett walked up the stone steps, a draft notice folded neatly in his hand. The street outside buzzed with talk of protests, of body counts, of a war thousands of miles away. Inside the courthouse, it was quiet. A silence heavy with consequence. Bennett wasn't there to escape service. He was there to define how he would serve. He stood before a clerk and declared himself a conscientious objector. The words felt strange in his mouth, fragile but true. He explained that his faith forbade him from taking life, that he would serve his country, but not with a rifle, not by killing. The clerk barely looked up. The world didn't know what to make of men like him. In 1968, America was a nation divided in two. On one side were those who shouted for victory. On the other, those who shouted to end the war altogether. Men like Bennett stood in the middle, neither deserters nor warriors, but something in between. They wore the same uniform, faced the same danger, yet carried no gun. To many they were contradictions. To Bennett, it was the only truth he could live with. When his approval came, it wasn't with ceremony or praise, just a letter stamped accepted for non-combatant service. He folded it carefully, as though it were both a promise and a sentence. Training began weeks later. Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Rows of young men shouted cadence under the summer sun, rifles slung across their shoulders. Bennett's hands were empty. He spent his days in classrooms filled with stretchers, morphine kits, and the metallic smell of antiseptic. Instructors drilled them on anatomy, trauma care, and triage. The lessons were brutal. They had to be. A medic's mistake could cost more than his own life. While others practiced marksmanship, Bennett practiced calm, the art of steady hands under chaos. He learned to tie tourniquets in seconds, to find veins by touch alone, to listen to breathing patterns amid the roar of battle. But training couldn't teach what was coming. No manual could prepare a man for watching friends die inches away, for crawling through blood and smoke with no weapon but faith. Some nights, Bennett sat alone in the barracks, listening to others clean their rifles. He didn't resent them. He just wondered if they understood the weight of what they carried. His commanding officers were sceptical. Some saw him as naive, others as a liability. But as the weeks went on, his discipline silenced them. He never complained, never hesitated. He was quiet but relentless. The kind of soldier whose resolve made others uneasy because it came from somewhere deeper than fear. By the end of training, the medics were sent to different units. When Bennett's name was called for deployment to Vietnam, no one was surprised, but everyone went quiet. He packed light, a Bible, a notebook, and a photo of his family. No rifle, no pistol, just gauze, morphine, and bandages. On the morning of departure, the airfield smelled of jet fuel and nervous sweat. Men joked to mask their dread. Bennett didn't. He just looked out at the horizon, the Texas sun bleeding red against the sky. He knew what awaited him. Not glory, but chaos. Not safety, but service. Yet his conscience was clear. He was going to war not to take lives, but to save them. And somewhere in that clarity was the calm before the storm, a storm that would test every belief he held and prove that courage doesn't always need a weapon. September 1968. Fort Sam, Houston, Texas. The air was heavy with dust and sweat as new recruits shouted cadence across the parade field. Boots slammed against concrete in unison, rifles gleaming under the sun. In the middle of the formation, one man stood without a weapon. Thomas Bennett, Private First Class, United States Army, medic, believer, and contradiction. To the other trainees he looked like a riddle. They were being moulded into soldiers, taught to kill without hesitation. He was learning how to keep men alive in a place where death worked faster than thought. Some mocked him, some ignored him. But over time the laughter faded, replaced by something quieter. Respect. Every morning began before dawn. The barracks shook with the sound of alarms, the air smelling of sweat and starch. Bennett moved through the routine like clockwork, making his bunk, shining his boots, saying a silent prayer before formation. He wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. He was there to serve his own conscience. In the classrooms the lessons were relentless. Instructors taught them to find a pulse under pressure, to stop bleeding with nothing but a belt and willpower. They drilled triage until it became instinct. Bennett listened, absorbed, practiced. He learned how to perform field surgery under fire, how to tell when a man could be saved and when he could not. That was the hardest lesson, to walk past someone still breathing because another had a better chance. Outside the classroom they ran obstacle courses through the Texas heat, crawling through mud while instructors screamed over their heads. Bennett pushed himself harder than anyone. He had no gun, no illusion of control, only his endurance. When others collapsed, he pulled them to their feet. When blisters tore through his palms, he wrapped them in bandages and kept going. At the rifle range, he stood at the edge, watching his platoon fire round after round. The echo of gunfire rolled across the fields like thunder. He didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His strength wasn't measured in bullets. It was measured in the stillness of his hands. Over time, his reputation spread. The officers began to notice that chaos didn't shake him. When drills went wrong, Bennett stayed calm. When others hesitated, he acted. Even the toughest sergeants found themselves pausing before yelling at him. There was something in his eyes, quiet conviction, immovable, like stone. At night, when the barracks went dark, he read from his Bible by flashlight. The others teased him at first, then stopped. A few even joined him, listening in silence as he read verses about mercy and courage. Graduation came with little ceremony. Most of the men were already focused on what came next, Vietnam. Bennett received his medic's patch and orders for deployment to the Central Highlands. The instructors told him to pack light and keep his head down. He nodded, knowing neither would save him. The night before departure he wrote a letter to his mother. He told her not to worry, that he was proud to serve, that faith would protect him. Then he folded it neatly and slipped it into his pocket. When the transport plane lifted off the runway the next morning, he looked out at the Texas desert shrinking below. Ahead lay jungles, gunfire and blood. But inside, there was only calm. He had trained for this. He was ready. Thomas Bennett had entered the army as a man of conscience. He was leaving for war as something rarer, a man who would prove that the bravest heart doesn't need a weapon to be dangerous. December 1968. Pleiku Province, Central Highlands of Vietnam. The jungle was a living thing, thick, wet and restless. Every step sank into mud, every breath tasted of smoke and decay. The air buzzed with insects and tension. That morning, Thomas Bennett took his first steps into war. His unit, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, had been sent deep into enemy territory on a search and clear mission. The plan was simple on paper: sweep through the jungle, locate enemy positions and return before dusk. But in Vietnam, simple plans rarely survive first contact. The jungle was an enemy all its own. It hid everything, swallowed sound, and made every man feel alone. Bennett walked near the centre of the line, his medic bag heavy on his shoulders. Around him, soldiers scanned the trees with rifles raised, fingers tight on their triggers. Every shadow looked like movement. Every vine looked like a tripwire. He had trained for this, but training could never prepare him for the sound of real fear, the deep animal silence that comes before violence. The first firefight came without warning, A burst of automatic fire ripped through the trees. Men dropped to the ground, shouting for cover. Smoke and dirt filled the air. Bennett didn't move backward, he moved forward. Crawling through mud, he found the first wounded man clutching his leg, blood pulsing through torn fabric. Bullets cracked overhead as Bennett wrapped a tourniquet, whispered calm instructions, and dragged him behind a tree. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. The moment he stabilised one man, he was already moving toward another. By nightfall, the platoon had lost 2 soldiers and pulled back to regroup. Bennett worked under the dull glow of a red-lensed flashlight, patching wounds, checking pulses, ignoring the fatigue in his own body. When the commander finally told him to rest, he didn't. He moved quietly from foxhole to foxhole, making sure everyone was still breathing. That first day changed him. The fear never disappeared. It just moved deeper inside, buried beneath purpose. He began to understand that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it rule. Days turned into weeks. The jungle took its toll. Heat rash, infections, exhaustion. It wore men down faster than bullets. Bennett became the heartbeat of the platoon. Whenever a man fell sick, he was there. Whenever someone panicked in the dark, his calm voice steadied them. Even those who once mocked his unarmed stance began to rely on him. By the end of his first month, he had treated more wounds than most medics did in a year. He didn't count them. He didn't keep score. Every life saved was enough. But war doesn't stay quiet for long. The ambushes grew more frequent, the fights longer, the enemy bolder. And through it all, Bennett kept running toward the sound of pain, into the noise, into the fire, into the heart of chaos. Each mission stripped something away, fear, innocence, hesitation, until all that remained was focus. He had come to Vietnam believing that goodness could exist in war. Now, surrounded by blood and smoke, he was proving it. Not with words, not with prayers, but with every breath he took while dragging another man out of hell. February 9th, 1969. Chu Pa Mountain, Central Highlands of Vietnam. The jungle was quiet that morning, too quiet. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of a man's neck stand up. Thomas Bennett knelt beside a wounded soldier, pressing a bandage into place as mist drifted between the trees. Then the silence shattered. The first explosion came from the ridge above, a mortar round, then another. The earth jumped beneath his knees. Bullets tore through the leaves like hornets. The platoon scattered, shouting for cover. The ambush had begun. Bennett's world narrowed to sound and motion. The roar of gunfire, the screams for medic from every direction. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the nearest voice, leaping over roots slick with mud, ducking behind fallen trees as bullets hissed past his head. His pack slammed against his back with every step, a rattle of morphine, bandages and blood. He found the first casualty 10 metres from the line, hit in the chest. Without thinking, Bennett dropped to his knees, pressed his hands over the wound and worked through the chaos. The man's eyes were wide, gasping for air. Bennett whispered nothing, offered no comfort, just action, gauze, pressure, breath. When the bleeding slowed, he dragged him to cover and went back out again. The air grew thick with smoke and dust. Grenades burst in the undergrowth, sending fragments slicing through branches. Bennett moved through it all like a ghost. Every cry for help pulled him deeper into the storm. He treated one, then another, crawling through open ground that no one else dared cross. A bullet grazed his sleeve. Another hit the dirt beside him. He didn't stop. By midday, his uniform was soaked in blood, most of it not his own. He had been running into gunfire for hours, each time emerging with another wounded man. The platoon was pinned down, the enemy invisible, hidden in the trees. Command tried to pull Bennett back. He ignored them. Every time someone screamed his name, he ran toward it. When a mortar blast hit the tree line, Bennett dove for cover, rolled and got back up. His heart pounded like thunder in his chest, but his movements stayed precise, almost mechanical. He didn't think about death anymore. He thought about time, how fast blood could drain, how long a man could survive without air. He reached another soldier lying face down in the mud. He flipped him over, pressed his hand to the wound, and realised the man was gone. For a split second, the world seemed to go still. Then another shout cut through the smoke, and Bennett moved again. He had become the pulse of the battlefield, the one point of motion in a world frozen by fear. When others stayed down, he rose. When others hid, he exposed himself. He crawled through open fields, patched wounds under fire, and dragged men out of kill zones one by one. By sunset, his body trembled from exhaustion. His hand shook as he reached for another bandage. But his eyes, calm, focused, unwavering, told everyone watching that he would not stop. That day, the men who once doubted him saw something holy in his defiance. No rifle, no armour, just one man against the storm. The ambush at Chu Pa was supposed to break the platoon. Instead, it revealed its heart. And that heart was Thomas Bennett, the unarmed medic who ran through hell because compassion, not bullets, was his weapon. February 11th, 1969. Chu Pa Mountain. The sun had vanished hours ago, leaving the jungle soaked in darkness and rain. The firefight had died down, but the air still trembled with the aftershock of violence. Smoke hung low between the trees, heavy with the smell of cordite and death. Thomas Bennett moved like a shadow through it all, exhausted but unbroken. For 2 days straight, he had treated the wounded under relentless fire. His hands were raw, his uniform shredded, his body running on little more than instinct. He had carried men through mud, patched wounds by the light of burning trees, and kept others alive with nothing but pressure and prayer. The platoon had lost many, but without him, it would have been all of them. Now, as the night deepened, a brittle silence fell. The jungle whispered with rain, and the wounded lay scattered in shallow craters. Bennett crouched beside one soldier, adjusting a bandage. His fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from sheer fatigue. He hadn't slept in 40 hours. His canteen was empty. His voice was gone, but his focus never faltered. Then, through the silence, a faint cry drifted from the darkness beyond the perimeter. A single, desperate sound, a man calling for help. It came from far out, past the line of safety, where enemy rifles still waited in the trees. Every head turned. No one moved. It was suicide to go out there. The enemy had baited rescues before. Men who chased after cries like that rarely came back. Bennett knew this. He had seen the traps. He had warned others about them. And yet, as that voice came again, weaker now, something in him shifted. He stood. The others tried to stop him, but he was already moving. He slung his medic bag over his shoulder, tightened the strap, and stepped into the dark. No flashlight, no rifle, just the sound of his boots sinking into wet earth and the rain whispering through the leaves. He followed the cries until they turned into laboured breaths. He found the wounded man half buried in mud, bleeding heavily from the chest. Bennett dropped to his knees, unzipped his kit, and began working. He spoke softly, steadying the man's breathing, his hands moving by memory now. Gauze, pressure, morphine, tape. The rain washed the blood away as fast as it came. Then, a flash, a crack of light in the darkness, a single shot. Bennett jerked forward, the impact slamming through his chest. The world tilted, blurred, dimmed. He fell beside the man he had been saving, his fingers still clutching the bandage. The jungle went still again, silent, except for the rain. When the platoon reached him minutes later, they found him lying in the mud, face turned upward, as if looking through the storm towards something beyond it. He had saved 30 men over 3 days. The 31st cost him everything. By dawn, the fighting had ended. The sky burned orange over Chu Pa Mountain. The men who survived stood in silence around their fallen medic. Some wept openly, others just stared, unable to find words. They all knew one thing. They were alive because of him. Thomas Bennett had gone to war without a weapon. He had faced bullets armed only with compassion. And in the end, that compassion had carried him farther than any rifle ever could. The last thing he touched wasn't steel or gunpowder. It was another man's life. April 1969. The hills of West Virginia were waking from winter when the telegram arrived. The Bennett home sat quiet that morning, the sound of wind brushing against the screen door. Inside, Thomas's mother opened the envelope with trembling hands. She didn't have to read the words to understand them. The army seal on the paper said everything. Her son, her gentle, stubborn, selfless son, was gone. Half a world away, the 173rd Airborne Brigade held a field memorial on a ridge still blackened from fire. Helmets rested on rifles, boots stood neatly beneath them, and the smell of smoke clung to everything. Soldiers who had watched Bennett run through gunfire now stood with heads bowed, unsure how to mourn a man who had seemed untouchable. The jungle had taken many, but this one felt different. It felt like losing the heart of the unit itself. The army sent his body home wrapped in a flag, his medic's cross pinned to the chest of his uniform. In Morgantown, the town gathered in silence as the hearse rolled down the main street. Church bells tolled, echoing through the valley. People lined the sidewalks. Farmers, shopkeepers, classmates, all standing still as the casket passed. When the funeral began, the church overflowed. Soldiers in uniform sat beside children in Sunday clothes. The pastor spoke of duty, faith and sacrifice, but his voice faltered when he reached Bennett's name. There were no words that could capture a man who had given everything without ever firing a shot. Weeks later, the White House announced that Thomas W. Bennett would receive the Medal of Honor. Only 3 conscientious objectors in American history would ever earn that distinction. The citation read like a litany of impossible acts: treating the wounded under fire, refusing to rest, charging into enemy lines to save others. Each line ended the same way, without regard for his own safety. When his mother stood in the East Room to accept the medal on his behalf, she didn't cry. She simply nodded, holding the small blue ribbon as if it were her son's heartbeat. The president spoke of heroism, of valour, of selfless courage. But those who had known Thomas knew the truth. He hadn't sought heroism. He had simply done what he believed was right. In the years that followed, soldiers who had fought beside him wrote home about what they had seen. Letters circulated through small-town newspapers describing the unarmed medic who ran into fire over and over again. One man wrote that he had seen fear itself stop to watch. Another said that Bennett didn't just save lives, he changed how others saw courage. Back home, his grave overlooked the same hills where he had grown up. The grass grew tall around the white headstone engraved with his name, his rank, and a single phrase: he gave his life for others. Visitors came quietly, veterans, families, students, each leaving small tokens, a medal, a Bible verse, a single dog tag. Thomas Bennett never lived to see the medal, never knew the word hero would follow him into history. But those who survived because of him carried something far greater than an award. They carried the proof that compassion could stand unarmed in the face of war and not flinch. In a conflict remembered for chaos and division, his story became a light, a reminder that even in the darkest places, one man's mercy could still cut through the smoke. Summer 1970. The war still burned in Vietnam, but in Morgantown, West Virginia, the hills had turned green again. On a quiet Sunday morning, the Bennett family church opened its doors to a small crowd. Inside, sunlight fell through stained glass, casting patterns of gold and crimson across the wooden pews. At the front of the sanctuary, a framed photo of Thomas Bennett stood beside his Medal of Honor. The words beneath it read simply, "He served without a weapon." For those who knew him, his memory didn't fade, it deepened. Soldiers who had fought beside him sent letters every year. Some wrote to his mother, others to the local paper, describing the unarmed medic who had changed their lives. They said he had run through the rain of bullets as if God himself had guided his steps. They said he made courage look effortless. They said they were still alive because of him. Across the country, his name began appearing in classrooms, in sermons, in quiet conversations about morality and war. Teachers told students about the boy from West Virginia who had faced the worst of humanity armed only with faith. Churches spoke of him as proof that conviction could coexist with duty. Even soldiers hardened by combat found something disarming in his story, a kind of strength they couldn't explain but could never forget. In the decades that followed, his legacy shaped more than memories. The Army Medical Corps began teaching his actions as a case study in courage. Military chaplains cited him when counselling recruits torn between conscience and command. At West Virginia University, a small building was named in his honour, a place for students to gather, to think, to ask the same questions he once did about duty, morality, and what it means to serve. But perhaps his truest legacy lived not in walls or medals, but in the hearts of those he saved. Many of them carried scars that never healed, but they carried his name too, a quiet reminder that goodness had walked beside them in the mud. They spoke of him not as a saint, but as a man who made mercy look like strength. Time moved on. The war ended. Helicopters stopped thundering over rice fields, and the names of the fallen were carved into black stone in Washington. Among them, etched with perfect precision, was his, Thomas W. Bennett. Visitors traced it with their fingers, some not knowing the story, others whispering it to their children. He had refused to take life, yet gave his own. He had entered war to save, not destroy, and in doing so, redefined what heroism meant. His courage was quiet, his conviction unshakable, his sacrifice absolute. Thomas Bennett's story endures because it stands against the noise of war. It reminds the world that strength is not only in power, but in compassion. That a man with no weapon can still be the bravest one on the battlefield. And as long as his name is remembered, on that medal, in that church, on that wall, the gentle warrior will never truly be gone. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I always read what you think. Hit like if you learned something new, and subscribe so you don't miss the next untold story of war, courage and survival. Turn on the bell for more history brought to life. See you in the next one.